Today I am going to be talking to you all about food forests and how to get a food forest started at your place. What is a food forest? A food forest is when you put together plants that do really well together with the aim of mimicking sort of a more natural forest sort of state, where your plants will provide food for insects, provide food for you, provide its own compost and its own manure. They're a lot more sustainable, sort of a long-term way of thinking about food production. They're really low maintenance once they're established, and they focus on perennial crops, which means that you're getting a lot more food in that sort of break in that really early springtime when your annual crops aren't really getting going yet. And also they tend to be your main provider of your fruit. One of the foundational principles with growing a food forest is that concept of forest. A big part of that is the fungi network, and they are a really important part of that natural life cycle of breaking things down and refeeding into plants. Trees in particular, especially fruit trees, thrive in a really high fungi sort of environment, and their little mycelium are all through the natural forest floor, and they're breaking down the leaves and the bark that have fallen to the ground, and then they help exchange those with the plants for some nutrients. Focusing on getting that fungal network started and getting it off to a really good start is one of the best things you can do. Earth has a really natural sort of cycle that happens. Bare earth is mostly bacterial dominant, and in bare earth like that with the high bacterial count, that's where you'll find things like annual weeds grow really well. For us, those annual things are our vegetables. Your vegetable garden will thrive really well, just that bare earth, high bacterial content. That's where manures and high nitrogen come in really handy. Then in nature what happens is these annuals die off and they create a layer on the top of the soil, and that's when the fungi are able to start coming and become more and more established. Bigger plants can grow and they die down and they build the fungal network even more. And eventually, when you think of the forest floor, where there's a really thick layer of that amazing humus composty sort of stuff on the top, which is just full of mycelium, that is the environment that trees really thrive in. So a food forest has got 7 layers that not every food forest has exactly these 7, but these are the 7 when it comes to planning that you'll want to be thinking about. The very first layer is the top layer, or your canopy layer. And if you have a lot of space, this can be bigger trees like nut trees or nut pines, but they have a really high canopy. And then underneath there, you can have a sub-canopy layer. You can just skip straight to the sub-canopy layer. They tend to be the sort of smaller fruit trees like apples and pears. So in a food forest setting, your shrubs tend to be your berry plants. They tend to be your blackberries, your raspberries, currants, gooseberries, worcesterberries, blueberries as well. Berry bushes tend to do quite well in sort of a semi-shade sort of environment. They don't necessarily need complete and full sun, so they work really well with this sort of dappled light from a canopy. Then of course you've got your herb layer, so they tend to be sort of more herbaceous plants, obviously. Things that you might take for greens, and even some actual herbs, they all fit in under there. And then under your herbaceous layer you can have a ground cover. Strawberries makes a really good ground cover. Creeping thymes also work well. And then you get into actually under the soil, so you can have a root crop. We grow wild carrot for now, things like burdock. Horseradish is another really good example of that. And then of course we start thinking about things that grow up, so you can include vine, grapes, passion fruit. They don't necessarily have to provide you food. They can be things like honeysuckle that provide really good food for bees. Sometimes it's best to wait until your actual trees are a bit more established, because often obviously a vine will like to climb up something. So if you have a really established tree, you can just let the vine climb up there like they would in nature. And then if you like, there's also the bonus layer, which if you can get your fungal network really well established with edible fungi, then of course you can harvest mushrooms. Now that you know what a food forest is and why fungi is so important, we can look at some ways that you can actually get planning your own food forest. The very first thing you need to think of is your slope and your site and how much access you have. If you have a hill, are you coming in at the bottom? Are you coming in at the top? How are you going to get from one side to the other? It's all well and good having a food forest, but you need to be able to get access into them. And think further ahead as well. You know, your trees may eventually get really big and you might need to get in to be able to prune them, or you may need to be able to have ladder access to be able to harvest fruit from them. Planning that access is probably one of the very first things you need to look at. Then you start looking at where the sun goes, which direction you're facing. If it's on a slope that faces the sun, that means that you can stagger your planting up the hill and know that the things right at the back are still getting sunshine even though they're at the back. And then you need to look at how water works on your land. Do you have springs? Do you have areas where the water naturally pools? Have you got seasonal streams or ponds or anything that might suggest that maybe you might need to do some earthworks or some ways of directing that water into better catchment areas? This is where you start planning out swales, ponds, pathways, all those sort of big earthworksy sort of things that you might need to do. The last thing you want to do is plant all your trees and then realize that you've got major water issues or major access issues. Get those big earthworksy things done first. A swale can be really useful, especially if you don't have a lot of rainfall, or you have a lot of rainfall and then big long droughts. A swale is basically a lump of dirt done on contour so that the water comes down and it stops, and then it's forced to seep into the earth. The other thing to really consider in that first planting stage is where the wind's coming from. Obviously you're not going to be putting in a windbreak before you're doing your earthworks, but having an idea of where some kind of windbreak might go would be a really good thing. I would suggest you put in 2 layers of windbreak, so do a really fast growing crop that maybe you could crop out for firewood or something like hazels. We have a plant here called Tagasaste or Tagasaste or Tagasaste, depending on how you say it. It's also known as a tree lucerne, and it's a cousin of gorse and broom. It's a legume. It grows really fast, and it also makes a fantastic firewood. That makes a really good first line for windbreak. And then inside there you might like to look at putting in a sort of more permanent, long-term, something that's a really good, well-known windbreak. Here we use something called macrocarpa, which is a conifer. Now the next step is to start planning what sort of plants you're going to be putting in. It really does depend how much land you have to work with. You can build yourself a food forest in quite a small urban backyard with just 3 or 4 bigger trees. Some of the very first plants that are really worth putting in ground cover full of high nitrogen peas, tick beans, and let them grow. If you've got really invasive weeds, for us the very first thing we did before we even considered earthworks or anything was we put tarps down. We got some old advertising signs from a company that puts those up, you know, the big billboard signs, and we weighted those down and left them down actually for about 6 months to help kill off the grass, and that meant that we could get our other plants established quickly before the grass came back. And then once you've got your plan, you really need to work out what grows well where you are. Picking plants is probably the biggest holdup that a lot of people have when it comes to planting a food forest. It's something that people get anxious about. You hear the concept of guilds, and a guild is simply a few plants that work really well together. I think the thing is not to get hung up on that. Yes, it's a great idea to have like a plum and a pear and a nitrogen fixing plant and plant them in wee groups like that, but actually having plants in the ground is better than not having plants in the ground. And these guilds are something that you can play with and you can add to. It's not something you have to spend hours and hours studying and being really careful about what you're putting where and when you're putting it where. And what I would personally do is pick what fruit trees grow really well where you are. Go for some varieties that you know will grow well in your area, and if you're not sure, try and contact your local nurseries, and they will usually be able to give you a good idea of varieties and types of plants that grow well where you are. And what you want to do is make sure you're spacing those out, so get yourself a good plan of your area, measure it all out and draw a to scale little picture on a piece of paper, print off the aerial shot from Google Maps and use that to be able to, you know, just sort of zoom in and mark out the area on that. And I found that a really good way because of course it's a satellite picture and it can tell you what's already there. Make sure you're not putting your plants too close together. If your fruit tree should expand to 4 meters, make sure that you're allowing that sort of size circle around it when you're planting, because when you actually get the tree, it's probably just going to be a little stick, and it's really hard to envisage that in sort of 5-10 years that's going to be a massive tree. If in doubt, get out there with a tape measure and actually measure your spaces, because you'll be surprised at just how far apart these tiny little trees actually need to go. Don't be afraid to put in more than you're going to need, because inevitably something's going to die, or something's going to do really well and something's not going to do really well. So you can overplant, but you need to remember that eventually you're going to start thinning those out. Another option is to put in extras of stuff that you know will grow quickly, that will work well as like a mulch layer, or you can pull it out and plant it somewhere else. So for us, it means we've planted lots of these Tagasaste trees in between our fruit trees, because we know, one, they grow fast, two, they're really good at fixing nitrogen, three, they make a great mulch, and four, we can, at the end of the time of using them, we can harvest them for firewood. We are using them for now to build nitrogen in the soil, to help loosen the dirt. The ultimate aim with those is to pull them out and get them out of there once the fruit trees themselves are much more established. Always make sure that you have a key and you write down the varieties that you're planting, because inevitably you will lose the little tag that's hanging on the tree, or you'll forget what they're called. And then once you've got those in, you can look to start filling in extras that you want in there as well. So look at getting some things that will fix nitrogen, would be my very first suggestion. Plant those between, if not between every tree, then every second or third tree. Once you've worked out where your trees are going and your bushes are going and your berry plants are going, then you can start adding in your smaller plants, your herbs, your perennials, leafy greens, ground covers. You can start adding those in as well. And this is the time where I add a really thick layer of mulch. What you choose to mulch your ground with is up to you, but I would recommend that you get hold of a local arborist, and they will often drop off wood mulch for you for free. Now, wood mulch is a combination of bark, wood, sticks and leaves all mulched in together, perfect for establishing that forest floor. You might like to, underneath that, put a thick layer of cardboard, big thick layer of newspaper, Hessian wool sacks from like coffee sacks, make a really good layer as well. Long term, your plants will start shading out a lot of the ground and the grass will slowly die back. The trick is just keeping the grass at bay enough for the plants to get established so that that can become a thing. Now, as for maintenance, the main thing you want to do is remove plants you don't want growing and encourage the growth of the plants that you do want. You can pull out grass, but I think personally the best thing to do once you've got grass there is to cut it and just leave it on the ground as a mulch to feed that soil again. You can plant things like comfrey, which make a wonderful chop and drop sort of mulch option as well, so you can plant those at the base of every tree. And look at planting in some flowering herbs, medicinal herbs. They're good to have on hand just in case, but in the meantime they also help loosen the soil, they attract beneficial insects, and they also help keep away some of the bad insects that we don't want annoying our plants. Once your food forest is a little more established, you can also look at adding some animals in. What we do is bring our pigs in, particularly over the winter. We have cooney pigs, which are a grazing pig. So they come in and they eat down the grass. We've also got a beehive in our food forest. Try and learn how to propagate your own plants, because plants are expensive. Learn how to graft, learn how to propagate your own berry plants. A lot of them are really easy. There's a lot of really good information on the internet. I mean, the worst that can happen is that they don't grow and you try again next year. Most plant propagation techniques are basically free. A lot of them, especially for food plants, involve cutting them in during the winter and just sticking them in the ground and keeping them damp. Now, where to from here? Go home, get yourself a map of your land and start planning. Work out where your sun goes, work out what plants you want to grow, work out what grows well in your area, and start building a plan. Don't get too caught up on the specifics. Don't get too fussy about what plants have to be beside which plant. You will get a feel for it as you go, and you can keep adding as you go. Get those big structural plants in first. Add as you have time, as you have plants, and as you come across different things that you want to include. Try and plant plants in more than one place. So if you want to grow Solomon seal, don't just grow one, grow 4, grow 5, grow 6, and as they multiply, split them up and spread them around. If you want to know more about growing food forests, especially if it's a temperate zone, because that's what my book is all about, I've written a book all about food forests, and you can get it as an ebook through my website, or alternatively you can order a hardback copy through Amazon. Thanks so much for your time, and I will catch you around.